From the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Friday, September 13th. Greg Walden has been a major feature of Oregon politics for decades, including more than 20 years as a Republican congressman. Now, Walden has emerged as the most influential figure in helping the GOP win back power in the Oregon legislature. Today, we're going to look at the shifting dynamics and how Republicans run their legislative races in the state and why the party is having a lot of trouble finding money through normal channels. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB's Portland City government reporter, Alex Zielinski.
And I'm politics reporter Dirk VanderHart.
Dirk, you wrote a story this week that called Greg Walden the GOP's best hope for winning back influence in Salem. We'll get to why that is, but first let's talk a little bit about Walden himself. He's been around for a while. Tell us.
Yeah, he has. Greg Walden, at this point, has been involved, as you said, in Oregon politics to one extent or another for actually more than 40 years. He began as a press secretary for an Oregon congressman, Denny Smith, in the early 80s. He spent 8 years in the state legislature representing Hood River, first in the House and then briefly in the Senate. And then in 1998, Walden won a seat in Congress, representing Oregon's fairly massive and deeply conservative 2nd District. It's a district that actually covers roughly the eastern 2/3 of the state, maybe a little more. Walden spent, as you said, more than 20 years in Congress, and he attained in that time some really prominent roles. He became the chairman of the very, very influential Energy and Commerce Committee. He was the 5th most powerful Republican in the House under former Speaker John Boehner. And he also spent 2 election cycles as chairman of the National Republican Congressional Committee, meaning he was essentially responsible for overseeing GOP House races across the country. Walden opted not to seek re-election in 2020 after his party had lost the House majority. Now he runs a consulting firm.
So that experience running national Republican elections is pretty pertinent for this conversation because for the last several years, Walden has been doing something similar here in Oregon. Yeah.
So in 2021, Walden founded this new political committee in the state called Bring Balance to Salem. And as that name might suggest to you, Alex, it was really an effort meant to help beat back Democratic dominance in the state by getting more Republicans elected to the state House and Senate. I would love to play some tape here from Walden laying out his grand vision and reasons for doing this, but he has declined to talk with us about it for years at this point. But people who work with him say he wanted to bring that high-level experience he developed in national politics and running races nationally to his home state. And, he was immediately very successful. This group has raised almost $11 million to date. In 2022, Walden spent almost $5 million supporting Republicans, which is a lot, especially sort of new money into the system. And the party was able to win additional seats in both the House and Senate that year. So I think there's a feeling among Republicans of so far, so good.
So 11 million. Where is Walden finding all of this money?
Yeah, number of places. Timber interests have been major supporters of Bring Balance to Salem, along with people from a number of other business sectors. But I think probably if you just counted donors by number, timber would be the most, the most amount of donors, but by far the largest donor. And really the person who has made this such a head-turning effort is Nike co-founder Phil Knight. To date, Knight has poured $6 million into this committee, and $4 million of that has come this election cycle. That has really been an interesting dynamic to watch, I think, because, obviously Knight is Oregon's richest man. He has very famously spent a lot of money trying to elect Republicans to the governor's office in recent years, or at least not Democrats. But until Walden began this effort, he hadn't put that kind of money into races for the legislature. So it seems clear here that Walden has been able to go to Knight and make a pretty potent sales pitch about winning back Republican influence in the legislature.
So at the same time, you wrote about another issue, which is that Republicans in the legislature have been really struggling to attract money that they normally rely on to support candidates, while Walden is able to do this in his own. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that has been an interesting change this year, actually. And before I get into that we should probably explain a little bit about how this typically works in Salem. So most election years, there are four central committees that run point on races for the legislature. Senate Democrats and House Democrats have their committees. Senate Republicans and House Republicans have their committees. And these are groups that often, cobble together money from outside donors, but they also get money from their members that maybe aren't facing tight races. And they use that money in this pool to sort of, strategically work on races that they are most focused on. What's happening this year, though, is when we looked at the numbers, the House and Senate Republicans haven't been able to find the money they usually count on. When we dug into this, we found those committees have raised about half the money that they had in recent similar election cycles, actually a little less. And at the same time, Democrats haven't had this problem. They are raising money at about the same clip that they usually do. For instance, when I ran the numbers earlier this week, the House Republican Committee, which is called Evergreen PAC, had reported raising a little more than $550,000 this election cycle, when in 2022, they'd raised about $1.1 million at this point. And meanwhile, House Democrats, when we checked this week, have raised about $2.2 million so far this election cycle compared to $2.3 million 2 years ago. So not all that different. This is sort of upending the normal dynamics of legislative elections, because this struggle to fundraise means that Greg Walden is now essentially the person with the most say in the GOP's strategy and where money goes, rather than Republican leaders in the legislature, though it is clear, we should say, that they are working together and certainly talking to an extent.
So what do you make of this? Is it just Walden that's attracting donors that these Republican groups used to rely on? Like, why are these powers being skewed?
Right. That is what we wondered, too. And what I actually found in talking to a bunch of different folks who either work in Republican politics or give to Republicans is that everyone sort of has a different opinion about this. As I mentioned, Walden's not talking to me, so I don't have his input. But, there are some who see it as Walden just becoming, as you say, the sort of dominant GOP fundraiser. One business lobbyist told me earlier this week that Walden is sucking all the air out of the room, as they put it. And as I said, it is true that Walden is attracting some big money from timber companies that also have historically given directly to Republican candidates. But other people you talk to say that is not the whole story. A number of people I spoke with say the legislature's top Republicans, that is Jeff Helfrich in the House and Daniel Bonham in the Senate, just haven't made a winning sales pitch this year. A lot of people also point to the 2023 walkout by Senate Republicans, which, as folks will likely remember, has resulted in 10 senators being either blocked from re-election this year or in 2026. And that theory sort of holds that typical donors might just not be interested in giving money to lawmakers with very limited time in office. They don't see the upside there. Actually, though, when you ask the Republican groups themselves, they have a couple of other theories or explanations. Bonham, the Senate Republican leader, pointed out that business groups that often give to Republicans are dumping a lot of money this year into fighting Measure 118, which is a proposed business tax hike. And meanwhile, the Evergreen PAC, that the House Republican PAC, says they think donors are getting more interested. It's a little bit late, but maybe the money's coming. They're not really sure. We are kind of in the home stretch here, Alex. Ballots in Oregon go out in about a month, so there's not a ton of time to make up the difference, but we will see what happens.
Yeah. And so in the story you wrote this week, you also mentioned that this lack of resources among Republicans, it appeared to cause conflict between these different lawmakers, at least in one instance. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, there's this kind of interesting little example here. Earlier this summer, a memo began making rounds among lobbyists. It made its way to Democrats. It got sort of all over the place in Oregon politics that really seemed to raise hackles among Senate Republicans. And this was a memo from Evergreen PAC, that group that elects House Republicans. It was essentially a sales pitch to moneyed donors that said, hey, Senate Republicans are going to lose this year. Actually, we think they're going to lose 2 seats this year. They're going to be in the super minority. Don't worry about giving money to them because they're going to fail. Instead, we have these 9 House races that we really want to focus on. We have 4 people we want to defend and 5 Democratic seats we really want to go after, and we need $6 million to do it. Give us your money, and we will put it to better use. I think this has been smoothed out by now, and Evergreen PAC sort of disavowed this right away, saying, this is outdated data. It was never supposed to get out. We didn't really intend for this to be leaked or whatever. But as I said, this created some sore feelings among Senate Republicans who felt like they were being thrown under the bus. And I think it just speaks to the sort of scarcity of resources here that memo even had to be put out.
I love a spicy memo. So we still don't really know how this will all shake out. Elections coming in a couple months. As you mentioned, it could be that normal Republican donors come rushing back in the last minute before ballots go out. But let's assume that they don't. What does that mean for Republicans this year?
Yeah, I think a few election cycles ago, it would have maybe been catastrophic. But today, the reality is that Walden, just as I said, has a good chunk of money. He's got like $5.4 million on hand right now. That seems likely to ensure Republicans are able to compete where they see opportunities. And in fact, that's already beginning. In the last few weeks, the Bring Balance to Salem PAC has begun to spend more and more on some of the swing seats Republicans are really keen on. That includes sending money both directly to some of the campaigns, but also paying for staff for the campaigns in some instances. And we should say, this isn't the best election cycle for Republicans. I mean, in the Senate, they have to defend a Bend Senate seat where longtime Bend Senator Tim Knopp can't run again. That's now after redistricting a pretty blue district that Republicans are likely going to have a very, very hard time defending. The House also has some battleground seats, including in Bend, Astoria, Woodburn, Salem. All in all, probably a dozen races will see the most attention this election, but it's not like maybe we saw in 2022, this map where the GOP is licking its chops and seeing opportunities everywhere.
And you spoke to some Democrats about this. What do they make of it?
I think they're just sort of delighted to see Republicans are having trouble raising money in one respect. But I also don't think they see that as victory or they're taking this lightly, because they feel like with this Walden effort, Republicans will have the money to compete. And I think people respect Greg Walden as a tactician. So they don't see this as this huge glaring weakness. I think they are looking at it with interest, though.
So we're in Oregon, where Democrats have long outnumbered Republicans in the state legislature. But this election could tip the scales even more, right? How could this impact the next session?
Yeah, Republicans are in the minority right now. They have 13 of 30 Senate seats and 25 of 60 House seats. I don't think anyone expects them to get out of the minority in this election. As I said, this map isn't particularly favorable to that. But I do think the key question is whether Republicans can hold their ground, or if they give up seats in both the House and Senate. Because if they do that, if they give up even one seat in both the House and Senate, it would mean that Democrats have a 3/5 supermajority in both chambers next year, which would allow the party to pass virtually any bill, including passing new taxes, which needs a 3/5 vote, without needing a single Republican vote. Lawmakers next year, as I think we've talked about on the podcast, are planning to create a huge new plan to fund roads in the state, and that is almost certain to include tax proposals. So all this could be hugely consequential in, the fate of that package and what the legislative wrangling looks like.
Well, I'm sure we're going to talk about this much more before and after the election and into the next year, but let's leave it here for now. Dirk, thanks for walking us through this today. Dirk, thank you for walking us through this today.
It's always nice to talk to you, Alex.
This episode of OPB Politics Now was recorded in the Gert Boyle studio here at OPB. It was produced by Andrew Thien with audio engineering from Stephen Cray. Our music comes from Audio Network. And if you just can't get enough of Politics Now and you want to see us in person, join us for a live taping of the podcast on Tuesday, October 10th at the Tomorrow Theater in Southeast Portland. And that's not the only live event you have a chance to attend this election season. Check out opb.org/election events for more information. We'll be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. While you're there, you can become an OPB member. You can also rate and review us in your podcast app of choice or listen along on YouTube. Thanks for your support, and thanks for listening.